So at this point, we can generate a map like this that has both physical geography and also a general idea of where settlements are or could be, and what those settlements are like. If you're new around here, all of this is procedurally generated, meaning you just set some parameters like how much of the map is covered with water and which share of settlements are inhabited, and then everything gets built from there using some simple rules and some pseudo-random number generation. And now that we can generate settlements in all kinds of different patterns, how do we group them together into coherent political units? Or, to put it another way, how do we draw borders on this map? And I realized that the idea of a map where all the land is divided up with neatly delineated borders is not universal. The real-world historical record has plenty of examples of societies with accumulations of wealth and long-distance trade and conflict over resource extraction, but no formal borders that cleanly divided the map up between one polity and the next. But these kind of borders are a standard trope in fantasy world building, and so I think it's something that's worth including here. I've gone through a lot of fantasy maps in trying to understand what makes for good political borders, including classics like Tolkien, TTRPG worlds like Greyhawk, and more modern fantasy like The Tainted Cup. Older fantasy tends to have more big, clearly defined kingdoms, while newer fantasy tends to have more complex arrangements like feudal or colonial ties. In some cases, the whole world is one big empire, and so all the borders are internal to that empire. There's also a tendency in fantasy world building to leave empty spaces on the map not clearly controlled by anyone. I'm going to adopt that here, but the way I'm setting up the configuration for this means that you'll be able to turn it off and assure that all land gets assigned somewhere. I've also been looking at a lot of real-world borders to try to get an intuitive sense of what looks like a real map. Although, of course, we're trying to build larger-than-life fantasy worlds here, we do want the maps to match with our intuition at a glance. I found it particularly helpful to look at internal borders, especially in countries where internal borders have had a long period to develop and adjust. And these tend to be jagged and naturalistic, but they don't tend to follow rivers, and sometimes do really spread out along the coast. So that's something I'm hoping to emulate with my map generation, just so we're building something that matches how people imagine a map should look. Anyway, with that shorter than usual introduction, welcome back to Multiversal Map Room. This week, we're adding borders to the map. Also, at the end of the video, I'll share some updates on the longer term direction of this project. So let's go back to that map we were looking at before. There's a lot of settlement around that main southeastern landmass, including some big cities and one ancient holy city, and then a few other settlements along coastlines or up on those northern islands. How are we going to get from this settlement map to some kind of political borders? As a first step, we can think back to the clustering approach we used previously to get a natural hierarchy of settlement sizes and functions. In a previous video, we drew circles around settlements with radii that varied with the settlement's economic potential. Then, we used clusters of settlements with overlapping circles to figure out the hierarchy of small and large populated centers. As you can see from this map, the clusters can vary widely in size from one settlement to dozens, but each one represents a set of inhabited places with plausibly some kind of economic ties. And so for our purposes, we can use these clusters as building blocks for political boundaries. To make things a little cleaner while we're working on these geographies, let's drop the dots for the settlements. We'll add them back in later on. Our first step is going to be dealing with the weird knobbly shapes of some of these clusters. Like, some of them have holes that are entirely surrounded by settlements, and others have sharp corners that don't seem like plausible political borders. How can we smooth things out? We're going to rely on the geometric concept of the convex hull. The idea here is that if a shape has any indents or holes, those get filled in, and conversely, if the shape doesn't have any indents or holes, it stays exactly the same. This would smooth out a lot of that knobbliness and the voids from overlapping clusters of circles, and it's also something that computers can calculate very quickly and efficiently. And when we apply that convex hull transformation to these clusters, here's how it looks. It's a step in the right direction. Now all the borders look weirdly smooth and unrelated to physical geography, but At least we're not dealing with these obvious large clusters of lumpy circles. We can do the same thing with the other settlement maps from the beginning of the video, like this one, which has a lot more small clusters. Of course, when the clusters are just a single settlement, the convex hull is the same circular shape as the original, so the changes are less drastic here. Meanwhile, on this map, a single settlement on the eastern edge of the map is its own cluster, in red, surrounded by a V-shaped cluster of other settlements in purple. What happens if we apply the convex hull here? We end up with that red dot and the purple V around it overlapping. This is something we're going to have to resolve later, but so far these convex hulls of clusters of settlements seem like halfway plausible ways to divide the map up into political zones of control. We just need to tweak the borders to make them look more natural. And one way to do that is to use the features that we labeled in a previous video. Things like mountain ranges, plateaus, depressions, islands, craters. I've marked a plateau in the center of this map in dark gray. As shown, it overlaps with one of the convex hulls. So we can say that a geographical feature like this all belongs within the same boundaries, and then assign that whole plateau to the same cluster. And now for that cluster in the center of the map, we're starting to get slightly more natural looking boundaries, but we can go further by using more physical geography to build things out. Specifically, we're going to look at contour lines, which track out regions of similar elevation on the map. Here's how those look. I'm showing 5 contour lines across all the land masses, spaced so that they're a little closer near sea level and more spread out at higher elevations. Let's say that land at a similar elevation tends to be part of the same political unit, because it tends to have similar economic activity, and maybe travel within that land is easier than climbing a mountain range or something. We can use this rule of thumb to grow the borders we've built here outward by merging in pieces of these contours with the neighboring convex hulls. How does that end up looking? Well, merging contour lines in like this ends up covering pretty much the entirety of that main central landmass. Some of these borders are probably too long and squiggly, and we still have that red dot in the middle of a big purple region, but we will fix that in the next few stages. First off, I wanted to show you how this merging in of features and contours looks for a couple other maps. Here's that map from earlier with the singleton clusters, now with contours shown too. What does it look like when we merge in contours and geographical features to build larger boundaries? On the upside, these borders look more naturalistic. There's fewer perfectly round borders of radii around cities. The downside here is that some of these are looking downright gerrymandered. Like that orange squiggle in the middle of the map, what would it even mean to govern that? So that's something we're going to need to address. And finally, here's the other map we were looking at earlier with one big cluster in the southeast. Let's merge in those contours and geographical features here as well. Because this map started out with fewer clusters, when we started adding in land along elevation contours and geographical features, we end up with a small number of very large polities. And now that we've built these up, we can start cutting them back. I'm doing this here because I'd like to re-add some of those uncontrolled areas outside of any borders. To do that, I'm going to start clipping borders along rivers and other geographical features. And if there's a disconnected patch of land that doesn't have any inhabited settlements in it, I'm going to call that land uncontrolled. And here's what that ends up looking like. I actually really like this change. Now there's a region of the coastal lowlands on the main continent that's outside anyone's borders. This feels like a promising region for fantasy world building, storytelling, and role-playing campaigns. We can do something similar with the other maps we've built up, like this one. The yellow region in the northwest corner is controlled by a single settlement on an offshore island, so when we trim it down, we end up with a big area on the mainland that's adjacent to that island and its city, but not directly controlled by it, and in fact outside of any borders at all. Again, I think regions like this make a lot of sense for fantasy storytelling, but this is also going to be something you can turn off in the configuration if you do really want every single piece of land assigned somewhere. And here's our final example. Recall that this map had a bunch of singleton clusters, and a lot of land got merged in when we added in features and contour lines. So when we trim this map back, we end up with quite a few voids where there's no control. And unfortunately, not all of these really make sense. Some of the uncontrolled areas are little dots surrounded by a single polity, or long snaky lines that kind of run parallel to borders. These make it difficult to look at the map and recognize what we're seeing as political boundaries. So let's just clean this up by assigning those all reasonably. That's looking better, but unfortunately some of these borders are still looking unreasonable. We have those singleton yellow circles in the north, fully surrounded by other polities, and of course there's still the gerrymandered orange zigzag running across the center of the map. So in cases where we have these overlaps, or these long skinny borders, let's merge together polities, and keep repeating that until we have borders that accord more with our intuition of how borders should look. Here's how things look after that cleanup. We still have some uncontrolled land and some borders that hug coastlines or wrap around a single river basin, but we also have polities bordered by rivers and ridgelines, and nothing that takes us out of the sense that this is a map we're looking at. Applying the same cleanup to this map gets rid of the big red circle overlapping with the purple area around it by merging those sets of settlements together into a single polity with a single boundary. And applying it to this map gives us that small set of large polities with fairly natural-looking borders. Let's tweak the way we're drawing this so it looks less like a bunch of polygons and more like a political map. Much better. This looks like a map maybe of a bunch of neighboring realms. Next, let's add settlement locations back in. From the way that we built this, each polity is guaranteed to include at least some settlements, and in fact, the big southeastern polity in toothpaste blue has a huge spread of smaller settlements between the big ones around the lake or on the coast of that southern bay. Let's give each one of these a capital, either the largest settlement or an extremely old settlement. You might recall that in the last video, we gave each of these settlements a history to work with. Let's also get rid of those uninhabited settlement sites because they're making the map feel a bit too cluttered. And here's how that looks. Starting with those clusters of settlements and then merging in natural features has given us a pretty decent looking political map, with naturalistic borders and uncontrolled areas and polities of various sizes. Note that we've done this all using deterministic rules with no randomness anywhere in the process. We can repeat that for this map, which has a lot more polities, including some very small ones, and for this map, which feels like it has a lot of potential for interesting story locations. I like the way that the blue wraps around the yellow on that north coast. It feels a lot like the borders of Croatia or Chile. From here, I think there are a few directions I'd like to take the next phase of map generation. Some of these could flesh out the social and economic geography, whereas others would highlight the more larger-than-life fantasy elements of the map. But in the short term, I think I'm feeling pretty satisfied with how these maps are looking as a starting point for fantasy writers, TTRPG game masters, and other world builders to create stories. And so I'm going to take a break from generating the maps themselves and focus on other parts of this project. In the next couple weeks, this is going to mean switching over to name generation, because right now everything on the map is called Island 1, or Lake 3, or City 17, and I'd like to be able to supply some more flavorful names. From there, I'd like to get this whole piece of software outputting something you can read with GIS instead of just a mess of Python objects. And finally, I want to get this all cleaned up and documented enough that other people can download it, use it, and experiment for themselves with this kind of procedural map generation. But for now, that's all for this week. As always, I'm grateful for feedback and suggestions, so don't hesitate to leave a reply. This video took a long time to get right because most of what I tried for borders didn't really work out, but I'm optimistic that now that I'm moving away from the spatial layout of the maps, the next couple updates will be quicker. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.